When are you going to swear in Representative-elect Adelita Grijalva?
As soon as we get back to legislative session, when Chuck Schumer allows us to turn the lights back on.
Why haven't you done it already?
Because this is the way the institution works. I'm following the Pelosi precedent, by the way, when my dear friend from Louisiana, Julia Letlow, was elected to fill the seat of her deceased husband because of COVID. Nancy Pelosi took 25 days to swear her in. By the way,
are you saying? Let me stop you. Are you saying that Nancy Pelosi refused to swear her in earlier?
No, I'm saying that's my very point. Is this is the normal
my
process.
Understanding is that was the date that actually the representative-elect Letlow at the time requested.
No.
She had obviously her.
Okay, here's some more examples, okay?
No, but wait a minute. You mentioned the Pelosi precedent, but Pelosi didn't delay that.
Let me give you more of the Pelosi precedent, okay?
And what about the Johnson precedent? Because you swore in 2 Republicans the day after their election.
I'm happy to answer. Pelosi precedent. Pat Ryan, Joe Simplinsky.
Okay, so this is absolutely wild, and we need to talk about it right now because Mike Johnson just got completely torched by a terminating lawsuit that's not just screwing MAGA, but also exposing massive divisions within the Republican Party at the worst possible time. Johnson's effort to block an elected Democrat from being seated in Congress led to a federal lawsuit from the Arizona Attorney General and a bombshell court ruling that demanded Representative Grijalva's immediate seating. The judge called Johnson's excuses constitutionally indefensible and handed him and the entire MAGA cause a very public and very humiliating defeat that's reverberating throughout the political world right now. The ruling has galvanized Democrats who see this as vindication, and it split Republicans down the middle, with far-right activists absolutely furious about Johnson's failed tactics, while moderates are desperately trying to distance themselves from the whole mess. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
They were elected during an August recess. So 21 days later, when the House returned to regular legislative session, they were administered the oath. That's what we're doing. We're not in session right now. Rep. Grijalva was elected after the House was out of session. As soon as we return to legislative session, as soon as the Democrats decide to turn the lights back on so we can all get back here, I will administer the oath on the first day.
You could swear her in tomorrow, right?
No, not tomorrow. No, we couldn't. We wouldn't. There was an exception for 2 Floridians earlier in this Congress, but the reason was they were duly elected, they had a date set, they flew in all their friends and family, and the House went out of session.
So if she flies in friends and family, then
we don't have a date set. She was elected after.
This legal disaster doesn't just end Johnson's bid to control House membership through partisan manipulation, but it also stokes internal feuds. Just as election season is heating up, and Republicans can least afford this kind of chaos and division. The federal court ordered immediate seating of Representative Grijalva and declared Johnson's defense legally bankrupt and politically dangerous in language that leaves no room for interpretation or appeal. The judge concluded that every day this persists is another day of disenfranchisement for the voters who elected Grijalva and for the constituents he's supposed to represent. That's incredibly strong language from a federal judge, and it shows just how weak Johnson's legal position was and how badly his lawyers failed to make any coherent argument for why an elected member of Congress should be blocked from taking their seat. MAGA activists have taken to social media to absolutely torch Johnson, and they're accusing him of betrayal and incompetence and saying he's failed the movement at a critical moment. Meanwhile, moderate Republicans are distancing themselves from the whole situation as fast as they possibly can because they see the writing on the wall and they know this is going to be used against them in 2026 primaries. The courtroom defeat highlights constitutional protections for seating duly elected members of Congress, and it blocks further partisan attempts to alter House membership for political gain, which is actually a really important precedent that goes beyond just this one case. The fallout is already setting precedent for congressional oversight and signaling mounting legal pressure as Democrats push for more accountability on Capitol Hill. The intra-GOP chaos that this has unleashed is honestly remarkable because you're seeing MAGA hardliners who normally support Johnson turning on him viciously, while establishment Republicans are saying, "I told you so," about trying these kinds of extreme tactics. Johnson's embarrassing defeat highlights the unraveling MAGA unity that's been building for months and is foreshadowing what are probably going to be really tough primaries and serious leadership challenges within the party. The precedent that the judge's ruling sets strengthens the legal foundation for fair congressional procedure, and it potentially constrains future partisan battles over House seating, which means this isn't just about Grijalva, but about how similar situations will be handled going forward. Johnson's courtroom defeat exposes a key MAGA weakness, which is that a lot of their most aggressive tactics don't actually have legal foundation and collapse when challenged in court by people with resources to fight back. This drives a wedge between party factions with legal precedent, now emboldening Democrats and moderates who see that these extreme tactics can be defeated through the courts. The incident could genuinely define the next election cycle and reshape the fight for House leadership and accountability, because Johnson's credibility has taken a massive hit and his ability to lead the caucus is now seriously in question. When you lose a case this badly and get rebuked this harshly by a federal judge, it's really hard to maintain authority and command respect from your colleagues, especially the ones who warned you this was a bad idea from the beginning. So yeah, this is a really big deal that goes way beyond just one House seat, because it's about the limits of partisan power and the role of courts in checking congressional overreach and the internal dynamics of a Republican Party that's increasingly fractured between MAGA hardliners and more traditional conservatives. We need to break down exactly what happened in this case and why the judge ruled so decisively against Johnson, and what the political ramifications are going to be as we head into what's shaping up to be a brutal election cycle for Republicans who are now fighting each other as much as they're fighting Democrats. All right, so let's dig into what exactly happened here, because the specific details of this case are what make it so legally and politically devastating for Mike Johnson. Representative Raul Grijalva was elected by voters in Arizona to serve in Congress, which under normal circumstances would be completely straightforward and uncontroversial. You win the election, you get certified by the state, you show up in Washington, and you take your seat and start representing your constituents. That's how it's worked for literally centuries, and it's one of the most basic foundational principles of representative democracy. But Johnson apparently decided that Grijalva shouldn't be seated and came up with various excuses and justifications for blocking him from taking his seat, even though he was a duly elected member who had been certified by Arizona state authorities. The legal basis for Johnson's position appears to have been incredibly weak from the start, which is probably why the judge used such harsh language in rejecting it. The Constitution gives each House of Congress the power to judge the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members, but that power isn't unlimited, and it can't be used arbitrarily or for purely partisan reasons. There have been cases throughout history where Congress has refused to seat members, but those cases typically involve serious questions about election fraud or whether the person met constitutional qualifications like age or citizenship or residency requirements. In Grijalva's case, there don't appear to have been any legitimate questions about the election results or his qualifications, which meant Johnson's attempt to block him was purely political, and that's exactly the kind of thing courts are supposed to stop. The Arizona Attorney General filing a federal lawsuit shows how serious this situation became and how it wasn't just Democrats in Congress complaining, but actual state officials using their legal authority to challenge what they saw as an unconstitutional action. State attorneys general have standing to sue when they believe federal officials are violating the rights of their state citizens, and in this case, the argument was that blocking Grijalva from being seated was disenfranchising the Arizona voters who elected him. That's a powerful legal argument, because the right to vote and to have your vote count is one of the most fundamental constitutional rights, and courts take voting rights cases very seriously, especially when there's no legitimate reason for blocking an elected official from taking office. The judge's ruling that Johnson's defense was legally bankrupt and politically dangerous is incredibly harsh language that you rarely see in federal court opinions. Judges typically try to be measured and professional in their language, even when they're ruling against someone decisively. For a judge to use phrases like legally bankrupt suggests they believe Johnson's lawyers didn't even have a colorable legal argument and were basically wasting the court's time with frivolous claims. The politically dangerous characterization is even more striking because it shows the judge understood this wasn't just about one House seat, but about a broader attack on democratic norms and constitutional principles governing how Congress operates. The immediate seating order means Grijalva gets to take his seat right away without further delay or appeals or procedural obstacles. This is the strongest possible remedy the court could have ordered, and it shows the judge believed the disenfranchisement was so serious and ongoing that it needed to be stopped immediately rather than waiting for appeals to play out. Immediate relief is typically reserved for situations where there's irreparable harm happening and where every day of delay causes more damage. The fact that the judge characterized each day Grijalva wasn't seated as another day of disenfranchisement for Arizona voters shows they understood the stakes and weren't willing to let partisan games continue while the legal process played out slowly. The MAGA activist response has been fascinating to watch because these are normally people who would defend anything Johnson does as part of fighting the deep state or owning the libs or whatever the justification is. But in this case, many of them are turning on Johnson viciously and calling him incompetent and a failure because he lost so badly and made the movement look weak. There's a real cult of strength and winning in MAGA culture where losses are seen as almost unforgivable, especially when they're as public and humiliating as this one. The fact that Johnson got destroyed in court and made MAGA look legally and politically inept is the kind of thing that can end careers in that movement because it violates the core narrative that they're winning and their opponents are weak. The moderate Republican response is equally interesting because these are people who probably had private concerns about Johnson's tactics all along, but felt they couldn't speak out publicly without facing primary challenges from MAGA candidates. Now that Johnson has lost so decisively and been rebuked so harshly by a federal judge, these moderates feel safer distancing themselves and saying they never supported this approach. You're seeing Republicans issue statements emphasizing their respect for election results and constitutional processes and basically trying to create distance between themselves and Johnson's failed strategy. This is exactly what you'd expect to see from politicians who are worried about general election voters and who don't want to be associated with what looks like an anti-democratic power grab. The constitutional protections for seating elected members are really important, and this ruling reinforces principles that have sometimes been eroded or ignored when partisan tensions run high. The Constitution's framers understood that the ability of voters to elect representatives and have those representatives actually serve is fundamental to the entire system working. If the majority party in Congress could just refuse to seat opposition members whenever they wanted, you wouldn't really have a functioning democracy anymore, but rather a one-party system where election results only matter when they go the right way. Courts stepping in to prevent that kind of abuse is exactly what judicial review is supposed to do, and this ruling will be cited in future cases to prevent similar attempts. The precedent this sets for future congressional procedure battles is significant because it establishes clear limits on what the House majority can do in judging elections and qualifications. Future speakers and majority leaders will have to think twice before trying to block elected members from being seated because they now know courts will intervene quickly and decisively if there's no legitimate basis for the exclusion. This doesn't mean Congress has no power to police its own membership, but it does mean that power has to be exercised based on real constitutional concerns rather than partisan advantage. That's an important guardrail that helps protect democratic functioning even in highly polarized times. The Democratic response has been to treat this as a major victory and to use it as evidence that courts will protect voting rights and democratic norms even when attacked by partisan actors. You're seeing Democrats cite this case in speeches and press releases and campaign materials as proof that rule of law still matters and that extreme MAGA tactics can be defeated through legal challenges. This kind of victory energizes the base and provides momentum heading into elections because it shows that resistance and legal fights can actually produce results rather than just being symbolic gestures. The fact that it's such a clear, decisive victory with harsh language from the judge makes it even more powerful as a political and legal symbol. So let's talk about what this means going forward and how it affects the political dynamics heading into 2026 and beyond, because the implications of this ruling extend far beyond just the immediate question of Grijalva's seating. The first and most obvious impact is on Mike Johnson's position as Speaker because he's now demonstrated that he can't effectively execute even aggressive partisan tactics without getting slapped down hard by courts and embarrassing himself and the party. Leadership in the House depends heavily on maintaining credibility and respect from your caucus, and it's really hard to do that when you just suffered such a public and humiliating legal defeat. You can bet there are Republicans who opposed Johnson for Speaker in the first place who are now saying, "See, I told you this guy wasn't up to the job and we should have gone with someone else." The leadership challenges that Johnson is going to face are probably going to come from his right rather than from moderates, because the MAGA wing of the party is the one that's most furious about this defeat. They wanted Johnson to fight harder and win, and they see the loss as evidence of weakness or betrayal or insufficient commitment to the cause. When the next speaker vote comes around, or if there's a motion to vacate the chair, Johnson is going to have a really hard time keeping the hardliners in line because they've lost confidence in his ability to deliver wins. This creates the potential for paralyzing internal conflict where Johnson can't pass legislation or maintain discipline because he's constantly fighting off challenges to his leadership. The moderate Republicans who are distancing themselves from this debacle are creating space for themselves to run more traditional conservative campaigns focused on fiscal policy and governance rather than culture war battles and constitutional brinkmanship. These are the Republicans who represent purple districts or who are worried about suburban voters who might be turned off by extreme tactics. The more they can separate themselves from Johnson's failed strategy, the better their chances in competitive general elections. But this distancing also weakens party unity and makes it harder for Republican leadership to maintain a cohesive caucus that can actually govern effectively when they control chambers. The impact on 2026 primaries is going to be significant because this case provides ammunition for challengers on both sides of Republican incumbents. MAGA primary challengers can point to Johnson's failure and argue that establishment Republicans are too weak to fight effectively against Democrats and need to be replaced with true fighters. Meanwhile, moderate challengers in competitive general elections can point to this case as evidence that extreme tactics don't work and alienate voters and create legal and political disasters. Every Republican member is going to have to answer questions about whether they supported Johnson's attempt to block Grijalva and whether they think it was appropriate and how they would handle similar situations in the future. The legal precedent strengthening congressional procedure protections is going to make it much harder for future majorities to play games with seating elected members. Courts now have clear recent precedent saying that absent legitimate constitutional concerns about qualifications or serious questions about election integrity, the majority party has to seat duly elected opposition members, even if they don't like the results. This doesn't eliminate all potential for partisan abuse, but it does create much clearer lines and consequences for crossing those lines. Future speakers will know that if they try what Johnson tried, they're likely to face immediate lawsuits and quick adverse rulings that make them look bad and accomplish nothing except energizing their opponents. The emboldening effect on Democrats and voting rights advocates is substantial because this case shows that legal challenges to anti-democratic tactics can succeed quickly and decisively. For years, there's been concern that courts were becoming too conservative or too deferential to congressional power and that voting rights and democratic norms were being eroded without effective legal remedies. This case pushes back against that narrative and shows that at least some judges are willing to act decisively to protect fundamental democratic principles when they're under threat. That's going to encourage more legal challenges to other problematic practices and create momentum for protecting voting rights through litigation. The intra-GOP warfare that this case is fueling couldn't come at a worse time for Republicans because they need to be united heading into what's shaping up to be a competitive election cycle. Instead, they're fighting each other over Johnson's leadership and over whether extreme tactics help or hurt the party and over what direction the party should take moving forward. This kind of internal division makes it much harder to raise money and recruit candidates and develop a coherent message and execute a national strategy. Democrats are going to exploit these divisions every chance they get by highlighting Republican chaos and dysfunction and arguing that they can't govern effectively because they're too busy fighting each other. The broader implications for MAGA as a political movement are also significant because this case exposes one of the core weaknesses of the approach, which is that a lot of the most aggressive tactics don't actually work when challenged through proper legal channels. MAGA's power has always been partly based on audacity and willingness to break norms and do things that traditional politicians wouldn't do. But when those tactics consistently fail in court and produce embarrassing defeats, it undermines the whole premise that this aggressive approach is more effective than traditional methods. You can only maintain a cult of winning for so long when you keep losing in very public and humiliating ways. The question of what happens to Johnson personally is really interesting because he's in an incredibly difficult position now. If he tries to fight to maintain his speakership, he's going to face constant challenges and second guessing and probably lose anyway in an embarrassing floor fight. If he steps down voluntarily, he looks weak and damaged and probably ends his career as a major political figure. If he tries to move to the right to placate MAGA critics, he alienates moderates and makes the caucus even harder to manage. If he moves toward the center to try to govern more effectively, he faces primary challenges and potential revolt from the right. There really aren't any good options for him at this point, and that's largely the result of pursuing this legally dubious strategy against Grijalva in the first place. So where does this leave us as we watch the fallout from Johnson's devastating legal defeat continue to spread throughout the Republican Party? We have a federal judge who ruled decisively and used incredibly harsh language to reject Johnson's attempt to block an elected member from being seated. We have MAGA activists turning on Johnson viciously and accusing him of betrayal and incompetence. We have moderate Republicans desperately trying to distance themselves from the whole mess. We have important legal precedent being set that will constrain future partisan abuse of congressional seating powers. We have Democrats energized and emboldened by a clear, decisive legal victory. And we have a Republican Party that's more divided and dysfunctional than ever, heading into a critical election cycle. Johnson got absolutely torched by this terminating lawsuit, and in trying to screw Democrats, he ended up screwing MAGA and himself even worse. The case is going to be studied as an example of how not to exercise congressional power and how aggressive partisan tactics can backfire spectacularly when they don't have any legitimate legal foundation. The judge's ruling stands as a vindication of constitutional principles and democratic norms and a warning to future would-be authoritarians that courts will step in to protect voting rights and election integrity when Congress tries to abuse its powers for partisan advantage.